Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining this live stream. Now in this stream I'm going to try something a little bit different, still I guess in the wider category of news and politics, but we're going to go back in history here, military history in fact, and discuss the issues in and around the Battle of Stalingrad. Now to do a full length video on this I really need to have maps and graphics and various imagery and even footage running on here. So because I'm doing just like a new or radio announcement type thing, I'm going to cut it a little bit short. So I'll be taking a few shortcuts here just to engage in a bit of brevity. All right, so with that said, let's jump in. And I'll use the term Wehrmacht to use the German armed forces. And I'll just use generically the term Red Army, but that Red Army really means Red Air Force and even some of the naval units on the Black Sea and so on, and Caspian Sea. So let's go into it then. Now in 1941 to 42, so effectively the first 12 months of this, the biggest military struggle in history, the Red Army suffered close to 6 million casualties in terms of prisoners, deaths, and also people who were invalided and could no longer participate in the struggle. So that's huge losses for any army to take. On top of that, they lost many thousands of tanks and aircraft and so on. So in addition, the Wehrmacht captured a lot of territory, going from Leningrad in the north to Rostov on the Don River near the Black Sea in the south. So vast territories have been captured, most of the Ukraine, Belarus, and quite a few parts of Russia as well. So this gives you an idea of just in the first, really that was achieved in the first 6 months. There was a substantial, the Wehrmacht overreached in the cold weather. It was a very unusually cold winter, and they just didn't have sufficient supplies to withstand the winter, believing that victory was just around the corner. So stalemate then emerged for the end of 1941 and into 1942. There was a major Russian offensive, a Red Army offensive in the south, just in the spring. And so come the opening of summer, the Wehrmacht launched their campaign to get to the Don River, which they were going to anchor their front off the industrial city of Stalingrad, and also we're going to go south and try and capture the oil fields at Maykop and Grozny, and of course the main oil fields at Baku. So, and oil was a big deal. The Wehrmacht knew they needed oil, and Hitler was acutely aware of that, and commented on a number of times that unless they addressed the oil issue, they were in trouble. So this is where it opened in the summer of 1942. So the drive to Stalingrad. The Red Army had launched an offensive just a little bit south of Moscow. General Zhukov had been in charge of that offensive. They'd suffered heavy casualties there, and the Wehrmacht intelligence looked at the casualties the Russians suffered in 1941, and they'd also suffered another 650 plus thousand casualties, if not 700,000, depending on whose numbers, already in 1942. So it was quite reasonable for Wehrmacht intelligence to think that the Red Army was just running out of warm bodies to put in the front, and the training that some of the people they were seeing were coming through was very basic. A few weeks training, a rifle was put in their hand, and off they went. So the Wehrmacht intelligence and just the general, the senior officers looking at the front were quite reasonably saying, well, gee, these guys must be close to their last legs, or being on their last legs. So once the drive to the Stalingrad had begun, then they were finding, the Wehrmacht was finding there wasn't a whole lot of opposition there. What they encountered was crumbling. There was some serious fighting around Voronezh and up towards the Moscow region, but which is where the Red Army was holding most of their reserves, sort of near and around Moscow. But other than that, the rest of the front appeared to be crumbling. And as far as Wehrmacht intelligence goes, it seemed as if the war was close to being over. And that was a reasonable assumption to make. That wasn't unreasonable. It wasn't crazy Hitler or Hitler going mad or anything like that. It was a reasonable assumption to take. There's a couple of caveats need to be mentioned here, and this is very critical. The Russians had gone to total war mobilization. Everything was mobilized. Old men and children were working in factories. Women were employed in support roles and manning anti-aircraft guns, and even in some cases, snipers. They pretend to be peasants on a farm, but then would be snipers, in fact. And it was a total mobilization. I don't think there's ever been an economy in the history of the world that's been so totally mobilized and focused on war as the Russian economy was, and of course all industry and so on. By contrast, the German economy was operating not far off peacetime. Hitler was very focused on making sure there are plenty of consumer goods for German citizens. He was very focused on making sure that the privations of war would be minimally applied to the German citizenry. And there were privations, there was oil and so on were in short supply, and a few other things, but rubber. But basically the privations of war were not widely felt in Germany by the German citizenry, at least certainly nothing compared to what was going on in Russia, or for that matter in Britain, the sort of rationing that they were doing in Britain that hadn't yet arrived in Germany. So the German economy could have very easily been mobilized for war. But when Hitler made inquiries about manufacturing extra tanks, or it was requested of him by the senior army officers, he would sit down with industry leaders and say, look, we need to produce another 100 or 150 tanks a month to prosecute the war. And they said, well, fine, we can do that, but we have to stop producing all these consumer goods. Factories that are producing consumer goods have to be turned over to wartime production. And Hitler always backed away from that and said, no, I don't want that. Now, later on in 1943, they had to do it anyway, so there was no choice. But Hitler could have pulled the trigger on that at any time earlier in the war. And had he done so, the war would probably have turned out very differently. The shortage of tanks and the shortage of spare parts for tanks in particular played quite a big role in reducing the Wehrmacht effectiveness, and certainly in 1942, the later stages of 1942. So as the Wehrmacht, particularly the armour, started arriving in Stalingrad or getting close to Stalingrad. Bear in mind, the armour's out ahead of the infantry. The infantry is fighting its way down the riverbank towards Stalingrad. That's General Paulus's army, and but the tanks could have entered Stalingrad and taken the city without a struggle. There was only a few anti-aircraft batteries really there at the time, so it was virtually undefended. But then the Wehrmacht High Command, or the Army High Command, I guess, decided that they should go divert the armour away from Stalingrad, which could have been taken without a fight, divert the armour away from Stalingrad and send it down to assist with capturing the oil fields. Now, they were hoping to bag a bunch of prisoners down that were retreating from Rostov and down through the isthmus there in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and hope they could bag a bunch of prisoners. The prisoners, or whatever prisoners were potentially there, and ended up mostly getting away. They got some. So the armour being directed down there really didn't achieve much, nor did it particularly achieve much more than in terms of capturing the oil fields. Now, what theoretically could have been done at this stage, they could have left the armour down there in near the oil fields and decisively captured those oil fields. That could have been done, but instead, the infantry from General Paulus's army was starting to arrive in Stalingrad at about an equal rate to the Red Army that was sending reinforcements to hold Stalingrad. So they were arriving in probably equal proportion, and then the armour was sent back using a lot of oil that they didn't have spare, and it was coming back towards from the oil fields back up to Stalingrad. So there's a lot of wear and tear on the tanks, and a lot of toing and froing. They're using up vital oil and supplies, and but back to Stalingrad they went. Now, again, we've got a situation where the Wehrmacht forces and the Red Army forces were both pouring into the Stalingrad area at roughly the same rate and kind of equaling each other. With hindsight, we can say it was a mistake for the Wehrmacht and to some extent at Hitler's insistence here, to want to capture Stalingrad outright. They could have surrounded it, neutralized and mobilized it, and they could have done those things without having to sacrifice soldiers in the downtown area and amongst the ruins and so on. Now, the Wehrmacht wasn't, its major skill wasn't in street fighting and going room to room and so on. But it's fairly easy to train soldiers to just go appear at a doorway and spray the room full of bullets. The type of quality training the Wehrmacht soldiers had was for mobile warfare, for very skilled reconnaissance, skilled use of artillery at distance to take out strong points on an open field, that sort of thing. There wasn't, so the skill levels required to fight street warfare aren't the same, and all the skills that the Wehrmacht had an advantage over the Red Army were effectively lost as soon as they got into downtown and were shooting it out in rooms and in cellars and sewer pipes and all that sort of stuff. So that was a little bit silly. So with hindsight, we can say that was an issue. But again, according to Wehrmacht's intelligence, they looked at the losses that the Red Army had suffered. They looked at the equipment losses, the tens of thousands of heavy pieces of equipment and field artillery and rifles, all the things that they'd captured, and they underestimated the capacity of the Red Army's industrial sort of backing. They underassessed that and decided, well, these guys can't make weaponry quick enough to replace what they're losing on the battlefield. Now, this actually wasn't so. The quality of manufacture of the Soviet equipment was rather poor. Their breakdown rate in tanks and in artillery pieces that didn't work and all that sort of thing. The quality of the workmanship was diabolically poor in a lot of cases, but they were mass producing on a pretty serious scale. So they were able to counter those losses and say, well, we can afford to lose 50% breakdowns in the field, and we're still producing more than the German war machine is, which comes back to Hitler failing to mobilize for a war economy. So they're duking it out in the downtown of Stalingrad. Now, again, Wehrmacht intelligence look at the losses that they presume the Red Army is encountering, and look at the losses that the Wehrmacht is encountering, and they perceive they're roughly trading 1-for-1 in the downtown of Stalingrad, but they have underassessed the amount of soldiers that the Red Army can put in the field. Now, again, when you've got a total mobilization of the entire population for war, which the Soviet Union did at the time, you can put a lot of people in the field. You can put something like 20 million soldiers plus in the field, which is double what the Wehrmacht were putting there. So they can afford many losses and still field an army of decent size. So the Russians at this stage had probably 400 to 500,000 more troops on the ground across the entire front than the Wehrmacht intelligence imagined, and also several hundred more tanks than the Wehrmacht intelligence imagined. So this was clearly a failure of intelligence. Now these Red Army soldiers were very badly trained. The equipment may not have been reliable. All these sorts of things factored in, but they had them there. So as the Battle of Stalingrad sort of increased and more resources were poured in by both sides to this battle, the Soviets were still able, the Red Army was still able to form two flanking armies around the north and the south of Stalingrad, so which were held mostly by by the satellite allies of the Germans, Hungarians and Romanians and some Italians and so on. Now, none of those guys wanted to be in Russia, especially not in the winter. They had hoped, and they'd been promised the war would be over by now. They just wanted to go home. They'd already taken enough casualties in their view, so they weren't going to go out of their way. They really wanted to be a rear area police force and nothing more. So, but they were given frontline duties, and that didn't go down too well either. Now, the Romanians in particular were warning the General Paulus that there was a build-up and an activity of Red Army forces across the other side of the river to the north of Stalingrad, and it was starting to look a bit menacing. But Paulus and the people around him, it wasn't just him, and even High Command, the intelligence, were looking at, no, it must be just a resting area or a training exercise, or say it can't be a serious force, because we'll look at the losses we're inflicting on the Red Army. There's no way they could put those extra people in the field. Now, at this stage, Hitler, among others, was so confident that the war was just about over that he was even starting to send troops back to Germany, or send panzer divisions to France to rest up and these sorts of things. Now, the Wehrmacht actually could have assembled enough force. They could have put together another corps of motorized infantry and panzer divisions. They could have fielded another corps in the Stalingrad area if they'd wanted to keep it focused, and if they'd really wanted to stay on it. But they thought, no, it's just about over now, so we can give these guys a holiday, give them a rest, give them a vacation, and so off they went. So when the Red Army attacked to the north and the south of Stalingrad and came round to make pincers, there was a certain hesitation in the Wehrmacht High Command, and even in the intelligence. They didn't quite appreciate or understand or grasp or even accept that there were that many Red Army soldiers equipped that were around. To give you an idea, though, how precarious the Red Army position was, when they broke through the thinly held Romanian front to the north and even to the south, these troops were so untrained, their orders were so vague, that they were calling out on the radio, look, I've got to my first stop-off point, what do I do? And the Army Command, Red Army Command, is just flooded with all these requests for instructions and guidance. There weren't enough officers to give the orders out, and even the middle level officers, such as majors and colonels, even they weren't sufficiently appraised of the situation to be able to give orders. So it could only come from the more senior officers, such as the generals or even the political commissars, for that matter. So had the Wehrmacht had decent forces in the area and one corps of panzer and motorized infantry would have done it, because the Red Army thing were hopelessly disorganized. Absolutely, it was this chaos, hopelessly disorganized. They could have been easily routed, but the fact was the Wehrmacht had no forces in the area, or whatever forces they had were locked up in Stalingrad, or they were down near the oil fields, or they were on vacation. So the Red Army forces could have been easily defeated, probably with huge losses. And one imagines that if the Wehrmacht had been focused on having an extra corps there and responding quickly and decisively to the breakthrough, they could have routed both the Soviet or the Red Army pincers coming from north and south of the Stalingrad area. They could have routed them both and inflicted heavy casualty, 300,000-400,000 type casualties on the Red Army, which would have ended the Red Army activity for certainly for the winter and into the spring. And by that stage, if had they routed those two pincers, which they had the military capacity to do it, had they done that, then the Red Army really would have started to run out of people. and maybe not equipment necessarily, but certainly ran out of people. Similarly, if the Wehrmacht had held the Don River, where Stalingrad was located, if they'd held the Don River and interrupted all the north-south traffic there, then that would have had a material effect, certainly on the supplies that were coming from the British and the Americans through, what today is Iran and Iraq and so on. So this was one of the. This is one of them. It's easy to be an armchair general and with hindsight look at these battles or any battle. And this was the mistake that I believe the Wehrmacht made. Now, once they decided the attack was serious and was had hundreds of thousands of troops to back it up and so on, then only then did they decide, well, we've got to do something about this. And then a force was put together and put under the leadership of one of the great generals of World War II, Manstein. But it was really too late at that point. The defence in depth that the Red Army put together made it difficult for any mobile force to operate in the area and achieve a great deal. Paulus was a little reluctant to fully coordinate with them, although there were supply issues with that. And so another opportunity was potentially missed. Well, I think it would have been a tough gig nonetheless for Manstein's relief effort through December and into early January. So this is when Stalingrad finally, of course, surrendered due to lack of supplies, lack of ammunition, and so on. And the Sixth Army, or what was left of it, the Wehrmacht Sixth Army, as we all know, surrendered. I guess as a fallout from this, at that point, that's when Hitler decided that Germany had to go to a full war economy, and even not 100% straight away. He sort of ramped it up over a period of several months thereafter. But that was something that made it hard for the Wehrmacht to recover from, given that at this time they were looking at preparing for additional conflict in North Africa, and of course again in Italy later on in the year in 1943. So their resources began to be stretched to a point where it was always going to be a very difficult gig to prevail when they're being worn down by a much larger enemy, with much greater resources. So that's my take on Stalingrad. I think Stalingrad is winnable if there had been a corps there, which they could have done, had been a corps in the region, 3 divisions of maybe 1 or 2 panzer divisions or 1 or 2 motorized infantry divisions. I think they could have inflicted crushing defeats on the Soviet pincers there, and probably I'm not sure it's 100%, but probably changed the course of the war. So that's my take. But put your comments below, and also let me know if you'd like to see more of these. I'm happy to do them. You've been with Tacitus today, and thank you for listening.